Hello, my History 461 students. This is Professor Donald R. Collins again talking to you about the course and about some of the contours around the course. Today I'm going to talk to you about the themes for weeks 4 and 5 in the course, as well as to go over some of the paper assignment with you in a little bit more detail. I'll talk a bit more about citations and references and those nuts and bolts next week. But really, I just want to help you get started on both since they're kind of interrelated. First, I want to go over weeks 4 and 5 in a little bit more detail. You already have the lecture notes for those weeks. And so, the Depression years, World War II, early Cold War years, and the progression of African Americans around civil and human rights in terms of activism and specific activities to blunt or eliminate Jim Crow segregation are all part of those lecture notes. I don't want to reiterate all of those in painstaking detail, but I do want you to think about certain themes from those 2 weeks. Pretty much the biggest thing you can come out of this 2-week period moving into the heart of the civil rights movement and the post-civil rights era is in thinking about the fact that really the civil rights movement is just a capital C, capital R, capital M series of events that were preceded by movements for civil rights. There's always been a civil rights movement for African Americans in this country. That's the single biggest theme you can take out of this period. Period roughly between, say, 1929, working your way to about 1970, 72, 75, however you want to define it, is that really one of the core themes of African American history in general is the constant resistance toward white supremacy, toward lynching, and efforts to put us maybe not in the literal chains of slavery, but to put African Americans in some sort of box, under some sort of oppression or control, either through law or through practice, whether it's Jim Crow laws or the practice of lynching and race riots or mob rule. Both of those are examples of putting African Americans, so to speak, in their place. The 30s are a watershed period, though, for African Americans. Even though it's the Great Depression period is one where the unemployment rate for African Americans in places that they've recently moved to, like Detroit and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and New York and Chicago and other places, the unemployment rate in some of those places approaches 70% at the height of the Depression, right? We're talking about areas that are highly dependent on industrial work. Blacks are literally the last group hired, and they're one of the first groups to lose their jobs. Under legal context of seniority, right? They have the least seniority, and they're in the jobs that are most vulnerable. So, laborer positions, domestic servant positions. So they're usually the first that are going to lose their jobs. Of course, there's racism there too, but I'm just saying from an economic standpoint, not just a racial one, they would be the most vulnerable people anyway. And so you've got that going on in urban areas, while at the same time, as you know, that the cotton crop and its yield in terms of money has been declining for literally generations since with the exception of the World War I period, cotton has not been that profitable for African Americans, whether they're sharecroppers, tenant farmers, or actually own their own farms. It hasn't been profitable. So you have several things going on simultaneously. You have African Americans in rural South who continue to move north. This is still happening in the 30s. Maybe not at the same rate that it happened during the so-called Great Migration period between roughly 1910 or 1915 up to 1930, but people are still moving north, but not just north. They're moving to California. They're moving to Seattle. They're moving to Arizona and Texas and Denver and all over the country. Right? That's where African Americans are moving. And to give you a couple of examples, Jackie Robinson's family leaves Alabama for California during the Depression decade of the 1930s, just as one example. Another example would be my great-great-aunt who left rural Arkansas for Seattle in the 1930s. So that's a new trend. It's a much larger migration pattern than simply following the railroads to Chicago or to Pittsburgh or to Philly or New York. So that's one response. It's not the only response. African Americans who stayed where they were tried everything from forming unions with other African Americans, in some cases with even poor whites. There were attempts at forming sharecroppers unions in parts of the South, in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas throughout the 1930s, sometimes viciously shut down by white landowners and by police, but there were definitely attempts at it. There's a whole book about this called Hammer and Hoe by Robin D.G. Kelley, which goes over this whole process of labor union formation among sharecroppers during the 1930s. And the reason why this could have any level of success is because whites were desperate too, for one, and the unknown, I shouldn't say unknown, but an undiscussed and unspoken truth from this period is that 2/3 of all sharecroppers are actually white. Yeah, disproportionately in terms of population, yes, they were black, but most blacks living in the South weren't sharecroppers. There were more whites in terms of their numbers as sharecroppers than there were blacks by 2-to-1 margin. So they had reason to join together, but the racism and the oppression and the cracking down on these unions led to the dissolution of these attempts. That's in the South. In the North, blacks joined unions that tended to be more racially integrated, particularly the CIO, under John L. Lewis, no white guy, not John Lewis, civil rights leader John Lewis. This is another John Lewis, who in the 1930s tried to industrialize unskilled workers. So he worked with miners, he worked with blacks who worked in industrial positions who were out of work, he worked with whites, and he managed to try to form some sort of interracial coalition, multiracial coalition, to go on strikes, do sit-ins at factories, and so on and so forth, in order to win better working hours, better working conditions, better wages for folks. It helped that the federal government helped with laws like the Wagner Act, which allowed unions to be legal and also to go on strike in the 1930s. So that's among the other things in general that's going on in this period. But do not misunderstand. The fact is that there would be no civil rights movement, big C, BRBM, without the things that happened in the 1930s to African Americans. And African Americans on the other end of the spectrum, who were the elites, who were lawyers, who were activists with the NAACP and the National Urban League and other organizations, were doing their part as well. The whole strategy to dismantle separate but equal clause within the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that essentially gave legal precedence for Jim Crow in the South. That whole process began in the 1930s between a white lawyer and a black lawyer, the black lawyer by the name of Charles Houston, to put together a strategy to dismantle the separate but equal clause through painstaking work of bringing lawsuits to state courts, and then once those lawsuits were usually resolved in the favor of states, then the federal courts to basically say that these facilities, that these attempts at separate but equal legal segregation in the South were actually unequal, by attacking the separate part first in terms of attacking the unequal part first and then the separate part later. It's part of a larger strategy. I go over it in detail in the lecture notes. This is just one way, but there are many things that went on in the 30s. People who weren't being hired, oftentimes their communities realized that when white store owners and shopkeepers who or in their neighborhoods weren't hiring African Americans, they started doing boycotts. They started having what were known as "don't buy where you can't work" campaigns in order to make sure that people who, whites who set up shop in these communities, would have to hire African Americans in order to work there. This happened in D.C., it happened in Philly, it happened in Pittsburgh, it happened in New York and other parts of the country where these sorts of strikes, these boycotts, these marches took place throughout the 1930s. In so many ways, the Great Depression radicalized people, radicalized them politically. Some more African Americans who lived up north anyway were voting in the 1930s and started voting their own representatives in the Congress in the 1930s. Activism in terms of education, in terms of curriculum, and pushing Negro History Week as it was back then into schools, in terms of hiring and employment, and to put pressure on the federal government to do things around these things, particularly the FDR administration. And this only intensified with World War II, especially with 2 million African Americans still serving in the military during this period of time. 2 million, that's a big number, right? Serving in the military, serving in combat units in Europe, serving in combat units in the Pacific, serving in all branches of service, right? Getting killed, fighting against Nazism, fighting for other people's freedom when they're not necessarily fully free at home kinds of things. Those soldiers were radicalized after they came home in World War II to war Jim Crow segregation, potential race riots, white violence and lynching and so on and so forth. There's a reason why there's a spike in white violence towards African Americans in the post-World War II period between, say, roughly 1946 and 1954. And that's because those black soldiers were radicalized by having in their face the contradiction between being in a segregated armed forces while fighting against Nazism. Fighting basically one form of white supremacy abroad, or one form of racism abroad, and having to deal with racism at home. And so that helped radicalize folks as well. And so that's what you need to be thinking about when you do these readings these next few weeks, moving into the period of the civil rights movement, that there's always been a movement for civil rights, for equality, for changes, so that things aren't as terrible as they've been for the next generation of African Americans who have to grow up in the United States. So those are the things you really need to be thinking about and going through your readings, the lecture notes, the different events, and how they come together for African Americans. In terms of both the big things like migration, employment, and the small little things like community events and sit-ins and marches and protests and boycotts and so on and so forth at the local level. Both of those are interrelated to that larger thing. Okay, I have a few more minutes, so let's move on to talking about your paper assignment. I'm just going to read it so that it makes sense to me as I wrote it a few weeks ago. Patricia J. Williams wrote in The Alchemy of Race and Rights on the issue of African American identity and the belief in the American ideas of freedom and equality that, quote, to say that blacks never fully believed in rights is true. Yet it is also true that blacks believed in them so much and so hard that we gave them life where there was none before. We held on to them, put the hope of them into our wombs, mothered them and not the notion of them. For it took this long to breathe life into a form whose shape had already been forged by society. What hope would there be if the assignment were to pour hope into a timeless, formless futurism? The desperate psychological and physical oppression suffered by black people makes such a prospect unrealistic or otherworldly, as in the false hopes held out by many religions of the oppressed. It's a long quote, okay? It's basically about 100 words. And there's a lot that goes into that quote. A lot of emotion, a lot of legalism in some cases. So I'm asking you, in terms of this paper assignment, what does this quote mean in the context of both black migration and the civil rights victories in the 1950s and the first half of the 1960s? Is it truly unrealistic for African Americans to believe that the U.S. will be a place that will embrace them as equals politically, socially, culturally, and economically? Or is Williams's perspective an unusually pessimistic one? And I have in parentheses, or are both tensions equally true? Can you both be pessimistic and unrealistically optimistic at the same time? least consider your answer from the perspective of someone living in the mid-20th century, 1930 to 1970, not from your own personal perspective. This is a theme that I will hammer home for the remainder of the course, since some of you seem to think that being opinionated about something without providing evidence is perfectly okay. It's not. And for a paper assignment, it's even more not okay, if that's to put it another way. So what I'm asking you to do is to take a quote that really is about this fundamental question of, should we fight? Should African Americans as a group fight for anything in a country that is oppressive racially and economically and otherwise toward African Americans, right? Or does the evidence suggest, based on what African Americans from the period roughly between 1930 and 1970 did, to suggest that it's not entirely unrealistic to fight for these sorts of things? You know, based on the civil rights movement, based on whatever things African Americans did for themselves. Keep in mind, we're not talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 here or the Voting Rights Act of 1965, although those were victories that African Americans won and wrested from the federal government. But more of what we're talking about here, where I'm asking you to think through here in terms of evidence, is what African Americans did, you know, with some help, with help of white allies, white progressives, not necessarily the federal government, to make their lives better, right? Or is Williams really saying here that it doesn't matter what we did? It doesn't matter what African Americans as a group did, right? Or is it a combination of both? That to some extent it might not matter in the larger sense. You're not going to make America any less racist as a society by carving out a niche in this country. But on the other hand, there are, you know, that might be true, but on the other hand, there are things you can do to ameliorate, to lessen the effect of racism on average everyday people. And there are examples of that that are going on throughout this period, right? And so that's what I'm kind of asking you. I want you to play around, think through this quote a bit, but then address that quote based on evidence. What's happening in the 1930s? What's happening in the 1940s? What's happening in the 50s in terms of civil rights gains, in terms of civil rights losses, in terms of economic and cultural and social and political gains for African Americans, as well as losses, and sort of weigh that in how you interpret Williams's quote. And I also give you, as part of thinking through all of this, a piece that I published about month ago, I guess, on how black historians gotten it wrong around explaining African American history. Is it too syrupy the way we talk about African American history as being this history of triumph over the evils of racism, as opposed to, you know, wax and waning of how extreme racism can be in this country for African Americans, and being able to carve a niche despite that, but long term, don't expect racism to just go away, kind of thing. You know, so I kind of deal with these sorts of issues in that article too, so you can use that as part of building your case, one way or the other. So that's really what this is about. It's just the beginning in terms of this paper. I do not expect you to have some fully formed I've been a historian for 30 years kind of answer to this question, because it's a question that historians are still grappling with. I just want you to be able to grapple with it and be thoughtful about grappling with it in the process. And so that means more than just saying, well, this law was rescinded, this law was made unconstitutional, this law was passed by Congress. It's got to be more than that. It's got to be more about what people were actually doing, and what people, in doing those things, did they make their lives any better or not? So that's all of the thing that I want you to consider in doing this 4 to 5 page paper. Trust me, you could write a heck of a lot more than 4 to 5 pages on this. You could write an entire book on it. So keep that in mind too. So you want to be very specific about the kinds of evidence that you gather. You know, rule of thumb for me is that you always want to go with 3 key examples that you want to expand out on. Maybe a paragraph each, maybe 2 paragraphs each, in the process of going beyond the quote for evidence. So hopefully that's helpful to everybody in terms of beginning to understand what it is I'm looking for with this assignment. Just email me at donald.collins@faculty.umc.edu if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll be back with another recording next week to explain in more detail what it is I'm expecting from you to do in this paper in terms of procedures, citations, references, etc.